the general belief in the concept of money that's not a precious metal in your hand is very likely
this
to
abstract digital number on a screen.
digital number on the screen that you can buy something with, that's very likely to go away.
Yeah.
This is really why it has such enormous impacts, because we can speak about what industries are likely to be the most vulnerable, but it's not like we can have, let's say, 30% of the global economy collapse and the rest of the economy will stand on its own.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Moral Footprint podcast. I'm your host, Jeni Miles, and this is where I speak with leading thinkers on how we bridge the gap between individual and systemic transformation. Today's guest is Alice Kalro, a global thought leader in transformational corporate sustainability and founder of ArcH3. Alice has recently released her book, Leading Through the Polycollapse, which presents a science-backed perspective on where our interconnected global systems are heading and, crucially, what that means for business leaders. Alice's career shifted when she realised that mainstream sustainability approaches are fundamentally inadequate for the scale of challenges that we face. At the heart of her work is a question every business leader must answer. Are we doing what the world needs without causing social and environmental harm? Rather than focusing on incremental improvements, Alice argues that we need to confront what she calls polycollapse, the simultaneous breakdown of multiple interconnected systems, from financial markets to food production to social stability. She explains why most corporate scenario planning ignores planetary realities and introduces her own framework for systemic foresight. We'll discuss how financial system collapse may precede ecological breakdown, what this means for business strategy, and also talk about her conviction that those with privilege must match their courage to their power. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends or colleagues and follow us on Apple or Spotify. Thanks so much and enjoy the conversation. Alice, thank you again for agreeing to share your expertise here on the Moral Footprint podcast. I took part in your Sustainability as the World Needs program, so I have first-hand experience of how rich and extensive your thought leadership is. I wonder if we could start just talking about the sustainability field more broadly. You clearly decided we needed an evolution away from that mainstream interpretation of sustainability. So if you can share your own path away from that to then founding ArcH3 and everything you're doing now.
Thank you, Jenny. Nice being here. Hi, everyone. And thank you for your kind words. So about my path, I like to say I'm a natural born systems thinker. And this means that sort of seeing the big picture and how it relates to different pieces of the puzzle and what buttons need to be pushed for, the whole system to start behaving in a different way. Those things come quite naturally to me. And I've always manifested working as a systems thinker or a systemic leader from a very young age, from, student jobs and volunteering and so on during my degree. This did catapult me into senior business strategist and transformation roles at a very young age. That means it also catapulted me into the center of the tension between what companies say their purpose is and what value they create for their various stakeholders, and then the reality of the economic pressures and the shareholder pressures on the other side. And this sort of irreconcilable nature of the tension and the gap seemed to be something of an unquestioned axiom, something like, this is how things are, and if you want to get ahead in your career, you just learn to navigate that. There's no way to reconcile it. So I later pivoted into corporate sustainability, as you know, hoping that the gap wouldn't be there, wouldn't be so pronounced. And it was obviously the other way around. The gap between what was being said and what was being done was even way bigger. Maybe some people know before entering. I realized only once I was really deep in and so on. Thanks to living in the global south, but more likely thanks to living outside one's own culture, one's own societal context, where we never question how things are and the dynamics and so on, I gradually developed awareness of the systemic nature of the vast majority of the environmental and social issues, and therefore also an awareness that they needed to be addressed through systemic change, right? And in stark contrast to that, none of what was being done in the professional realm was aligned with this realization. For example, in the whole gap between the need for systemic change and the threat of non-livable futures upon us on the one hand, and then business strategy, business as usual on the other, or in corporate sustainability, again, the need for systemic change, and then the mainstream corporate sustainability agendas and the SDGs, right? In the circles where systemic change was discussed, there was a whole different gap between the theoretical discussions and descriptions of what a future state, a future economy, future paradigm should look like, and then the starting point of where we actually are. And a bit of a vacuum between how we get from point A to point B, which gradually started to be filled in actually with series of change that were not adding up with imminent environmental points of no return. Like it was just not, adding up to how fast this can be achieved or not.
And by that, you mean essentially what the latest science is saying is a potential threat for our future?
It depends on what you mean by the latest science, because different sources of science say slightly different things. But in general, there is a similar story being said from different parts of the scientific community, and that is that, in a sense, we have years before a regime shift on the environmental side into one that we won't really be able to control. And that means that very undesirable features of the future will be essentially baked in. So from the perspective of having really a few years, this is the decade to act and so on, it's just making it more concrete, right? With more science coming in, we really see, yes, we only have actually just a few years. This is the real window of opportunity to stay away from, some people say collapse, some people say hothouse airs, whatever we want to call the very undesirable futures. And so theories of change, of how we bring about this systemic change, need to work within that design constraint. Like, okay, this needs to be achievable within a few years, and they very often don't. Right. So seeing that I was growing more and more morally injured, which I know a lot of people can relate to, and at the same time, to a degree, motivated by seeing the gaps, because I quickly began mapping how I could apply my superpowers and my predispositions to closing those gaps.
Your unique ability to see that systemic overview that many people just aren't connecting the dots.
That is probably the most important one. Then I think being a pretty good communicator, being a fast and fairly eloquent writer. And yeah, essentially, it was really just the exercise that people normally do when they are writing a cover letter or preparing a CV for a specific job. You're trying to see, okay, how much of my expertise, how much of my strengths really do apply here? How do I make this work? Okay, this is what's in my toolkit. This is what I'm good at. This is not what I'm good at. And here's the vague notion of systems change. So how is it adding up? Right.
Yeah.
Once I've done that, it became pretty obvious where my contribution was to closing these gaps. At that point, I started feeling a very, very strong sense of responsibility. You can see my voice is shaking because it was visceral. It was a visceral sense of responsibility.
You end up embodying, you can feel it within your body, can't you? I know we talked about how critical these next few years are, and I felt the same, where my career at that point wasn't matching with the outer reality of what I knew to be true. I had had 2 young children, and I'm thinking, why am I spending all my time doing this when this is what's happening and this is the only thing I should think about? When we start talking about these words, whether it's collapse, whether it's, unlivable future, many people aren't ready to question or to even interact with that concept. It's the kind of thing that can really burn you out. How then do you approach this topic in a way that doesn't create that sort of defensiveness, or I'm not ready to talk about this, this is too overwhelming? Because so many people are shutting down when what we really need is more people to feel that responsibility.
It's a question that, honestly, I hear almost every day. I'm not necessarily an authority on this, but there are a few principles that immediately come to mind. We need to be speaking to people in the spirit of courageous co-exploration rather than confrontation. It can't be that we come to people and we just try to smash them with arguments and prove them wrong, which we often do because we feel so enraged, ignited, or indignated by the status quo. We want to embody that warrior spirit and go intervene. And of course, that creates defensive reactions. The general intention and attitude with which we enter conversations and the spirit with which we enter them matters a lot. The other thing is that we can't really be expecting people not to be shaken because things are so severe that there is no way to really put a very positive spin on the range of plausible futures, or to make it look like we have more time than we have, or make it look like, yes, thriving for everyone is definitely possible and it's even a likely scenario. And I struggle to do that because I feel like, okay, that the moment I try to put a very positive spin, my integrity goes out of the window. Second, things are really severe. Things are really existential, and we can't expect people not to be shaken up because the message is severe.
Yeah, that's a normal reaction.
It's a normal reaction, and that's the objective of sounding the alarm, right?
That's a good point.
Like, what does it mean to be alarmed? It's actually, we are equating it with panic. But if you think of the actual word alarm, like if you sound an alarm because there's a fire in the building, what do the instructions say? Stay calm, follow the instructions, leave everything unnecessary behind, leave the building, go to an assembly point. It actually points us to calmly seeing what is the important priority, what is the best thing to do, very clearly and calmly proceeding with what needs to be done. Right. It's not an invitation to panic. It's an invitation to do the necessary thing very calmly, very quickly. Right. That's something we need to find a way to embody and also not be equating that we are alarming people with saying that we are destabilizing people. Yes, people will be shaken up. The responsible thing is when we do have those conversations, making sure that some kind of a safety net is created or some offer of support or maybe pointing to ways to help process the information, like hand in hand with any kind of difficult information.
Yeah. I can't even call it a topic. It's essentially the biggest threat to humanity and to life for millennia. Let's not sugarcoat it. I think it was only during your program that I started to feel comfortable even saying the word collapse, because every time I said it, I was like, no, you don't really mean that. I was almost trying to pretend I was gaslighting myself. But when you look at the science, that's where we're headed. Maybe we can talk a bit about the book that you've recently launched, because you are kind of almost trying to control, in a way, who's going to read it. Because as you say, we do need to have that sort of supportive container to address some of the concepts that are within that book. So the book itself is called Leading Through the Polycollapse. Could you help our audience understand, first of all, why you chose to build on the term polycrisis with polycollapse?
Yes. And actually, before coming to that, there's one more thing that I think is very helpful to bring to the conversation on the previous topic. Yes. So I really like the analogy of going to a sauna. People who go to saunas want to achieve a good outcome, right? Their personal, let's say, resilience, their like physical resilience, the immunity, right? And maybe some relaxation, rejuvenation, and so on. And at the same time, staying in the sauna is very uncomfortable eventually. Right? It's essentially very intentionally and consciously immersing oneself in discomfort. And also leaving the sauna and going into the cooling pool. It's also immersing yourself into severe discomfort because you're doing it with a specific outcome in mind. Yes, and at the same time, you're not doing it carelessly and mindlessly. You drink lots of liquids before you go so that you don't pass out. You turn on that little watch when you enter, and you know where your limits are, especially if you're new, right? You're gradually building up to staying in the sauna, maybe at higher temperatures for longer, and you don't overdo it. You know that you have to be mindful that if you start to feel like you can't handle it anymore, you need to step out, you need to cool off, right? You need to rest before you step in again. And I think this is a very useful analogy of when we think of how do we engage with these existential topics. We have to do it very mindfully of our inner state at the moment. Are we getting triggered? Are we getting overwhelmed? Can we still handle being exposed to the topics, or do we have to step out and cool off? And I think this is also when we are starting conversations with others, we can prime them in a way by being very clear about this. Hey, I would like to step into the space of discomfort with you because it's important, because it's for greater good. And while we do that, it will be uncomfortable, first of all. Are you willing to do that? And second, because it is uncomfortable, let's try to do it very mindfully. And let's also have in mind for when we get overheated, how we're going to step out and cool off. So think through maybe actively with the person, what is something that then helps them personally cool off, because it's not one size fits all. They know they have the invitation to say, it's too much, I need to step out. And they also have in mind of, okay, I'm stepping out and this is what I'm going to do to self-regulate, to get myself okay. And maybe when I'm okay again, maybe we can continue.
Your analogy is great, because the way I've come to understand the broader polycollapse as you define it, it started off with awareness of climate crisis. Then I started to understand, hold on, it's not just climate, it's not just carbon. There's all the other planetary boundaries. And hold on, it's not just environmental, it's also the social systems and the financial systems. And I guess it was like a gradual awakening for me. Let's close the loop about the definition of polycollapse, because it is then about helping people understand the full holistic systemic worldview that your book is bringing to bear.
Why did we start using the term polycollapse? So it's a term that we propose as Arcade 3 to describe the phenomenon of multiple interrelated collapse processes of multiple systems and subsystems that are either already unfolding or imminent or highly predictable and probable, and which share a common systemic cause. Reasons for saying polycollapse is that a lot of people out there say just collapse without any adjectives, and they don't mean the same things. And it's interesting, like just as an anecdote, I was in Exeter 2 weeks ago at the Global Tipping Points conference organized by the University of Exeter's Global Systems Institute, and people on and off the stage would be using the word overshoot. But then the sentences in which they were using the word wasn't making any sense to me initially, because they would say, we've just entered overshoot. And I'm like, no, we entered overshoot in the early 1970s. So like, why are we not on the same page? This is like the most respected scientist on the stage. And then I realized they were referring to the overshoot of the 1.5 degree of global warming, whereas I was in my mind thinking, planetary overshoot.
Level, yes.
Yeah, and those are not the same things. And there's the same problem with the word collapse, that there's so many people say collapse something, collapse this, collapse that. And it immediately creates room for misunderstanding and disagreement, because some people will say collapse is already happening, collapse is imminent, collapse is reversible, irreversible, so many statements. And because somebody may be speaking about ecological collapse or ecosystem collapse, somebody else might be speaking about economic collapse, societal collapse, so many different things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. I was thinking more of like from polycrisis to polycollapse, but what you're saying is it's from collapse to polycollapse.
Yes, just to really create clarity that when we say collapse, we mean all of these collapses at the same time. Because it happens so often that we had some conversations with someone and they would immediately be like, oh no, but collapse is already happening. You can't say that people need to be collapse ready, because that would imply collapse is something that will happen in the future. Collapse is already happening. And such immediate like disagreements where we are on the same page. It's just that the word collapse is applied to a different meaning. Yeah, different interpretations. So that's why we say polycollapse. And indeed, there is a relationship to the word polycrisis, because polycrisis, a lot of people already understand that. Okay, a lot of crises interrelated and happening at the same time. So yes, it's not that they are unrelated. It's just, it's not a polycrisis, it's a polycollapse. But the primary motivation was just to be very clear and remove this whole room of for misinterpretation and misunderstanding and disagreement. We defined what polycollapse is. So first of all, you yourself said that when you first were confronted with people throwing around the word collapse, it sounded like, okay, this may be not even real or something like that, right? So when
it's almost like it's almost like for me, it was too big or too scary an implication that I couldn't even process it. It was like, I don't like saying the word, honestly, even though I know I should be comfortable with talking about something that is kind of rooted in empirical backing.
Yeah. So when I started hearing the word around a lot, I wasn't familiar with the science. And so that was one of the prompts to actually go and look into the science.
I see.
And the other thing is that a lot of the statements within the circles that I was moving in were very vague when it came to collapse. It was again like, collapse is already happening. All the evidence is there. And then it's like, okay, and what does it actually mean? Of course, there's the very influential book of Jem Bendel, Breaking Together. Right.
Yes.
And it actually lays out a lot of evidence that, again, different elements of collapse are already unfolding. And at the same time, it doesn't really go as far as to say, and this is what the future looks like. And I think for people
who are the missing piece, isn't it?
For people who want to really rationally understand and have a lot of like conceptual clarity and so on, because that's how we find our agency. That's how we find, okay, what does it mean for our strategy? It is that for people like me, it is a big missing piece. And so that was the impetus behind doing all the research that actually led to us creating the systemic projections that we present in our ebook and elsewhere in our work.
When we think about how businesses think about like planning and strategic planning, they look at things like scenario planning or risk management, and they think about it in a narrow way. Whereas what my understanding is of systemic foresight is it's, you're a business rooted within the broader systems at a planetary level. We're all within this broader biosphere. So how does your book reveal systemic foresight? What does that mean for an organization or for a leader, and how it differs from that traditional approach?
Yes. So I'll start with the approach and then we can go to the revelations. So how does it differ? On the one hand, if you want a quick way to introduce systemic foresight, we say, oh, that's like, traditional strategic foresight or corporate foresight. And then you just plug in the systemic perspective and the systemic understanding. But to be fair, it's not like corporate foresight or strategic foresight has never had of systems thinking. I think a lot of people would feel offended by us implying that the discipline already uses a lot of tools from systems thinking, like mapping systems and the system dynamics and so on. The problem really is that our collective starting point, as at least most of the global north, and this being cemented in our education systems, is the reductionist paradigm, which is behind the Western science, and the academia replicates it, and the specializations replicate it, and our career pathways replicate it. And what it results in is that our grasp of how the planet works and how human-made systems impact the planet and how in turn then the planet impacts human-made systems is actually completely inadequate. This means that then we continue under-assessing and underestimating the impacts of the planet, the planetary systems, and their interplay with the human-made systems. And I actually, again, have an analogy for that. We don't see the iceberg ahead of the Titanic because we don't posit that something like an iceberg actually exists. And as a result of that, even when we begin seeing the contours of an iceberg ahead of us on the horizon, because we have no relevant point of reference of what it might be, our guesses are just completely off. We just have no idea really what we are headed into, and therefore we are also completely unprepared for what is about to hit us. Yes, and now
I just want to, I hope you don't mind, I'm just going to quickly add to that, because I had a recent guest, Errol Kalasi, who also used the analogy of the iceberg, but in the context of tipping point, saying when the Titanic hit the iceberg, it seemed stable, it seemed fine for the first half an hour, 1 hour, and it was only in the last few minutes that the full force of the iceberg actually sent the ship to sink.
yes.
And I think that brought the importance of the timing of it as well. And I love how the systemic foresight diagram, where you're mapping it over time, which is missing in a lot of the conversations about this.
Yes. You mentioned the sort of narrow models, right? So what actually happens a lot in scenario modeling, as it is done now in organizations pretty much around the world, everywhere, is that the variables that it focuses on, they are actually not the most decisive ones. Again, because we don't really have a reference point for the planetary context and so on. And that means that the futures that we model are actually implausible. We say they are like little less than or little more than fairy tales. That presents a big problem because it means the strategies that we design based on the scenario modeling are designed to work in fairy tale futures, and those are not going to play out. So what we try to do with systemic foresight is transcend these gaps. So we first start by growing systemic awareness of the planetary context, and again, its interplay with the human-made systems. And that means that we dramatically upgrade our understanding of how the world works. And we apply this in the scenario modeling, essentially broadening the range of macro trends that are considered and to more of those that are really absolutely decisive for the future. It's really broadening the model. And we produce what we call systemic projections. We then translate them into industry-specific impacts, value chain-specific impacts, company-specific impacts. And those are really the strategy inputs and the design constraints for future strategies. And so what this really means is just having a procedure or a process, a methodology of translating the transdisciplinary science of air systems and tipping points and making them actionable for strategy, and having this method easy enough that any organization can replicate it and repeat it and really then act on what is knowable about the outer context, while also considering the things that are so difficult to fathom for us, like you mentioned, with the hitting the iceberg, and for a while it looks normal. The impact of tipping points, the nonlinear nature of change and so on.
I just want to touch on what you were saying, that many strategic planning processes are based on fairy tales and this fictitious view of what the future will be, especially the breaching of planetary boundaries and so on. I was wondering if we could maybe zoom in on financial collapse, because I think in the book you talk about, is it collapse across 5 or 6 different systems? And for me, the financial collapse aspect is very interesting because your book talks about how there's a risk of wiping out huge swathes of wealth. When we think about the financial system, it is predicated on this fiction, but also this pursuit of financial wealth above all other types of wealth is arguably the root cause of so many of the issues that we're facing.
I think I'll start by presenting another term or concept that we use a lot, and it's meta disruption. And it's analogical to polycollapse. It's a new term that we introduce, and it really describes a particular stage of polycollapse futures, which is on the current trajectory, very likely to play out probably in the 2030s. And it really points to the predictable aggravation and compounding effects from interaction between current trends. Many of us already know, right? There are very many sources of disruption ahead. Again, climate destabilization, food systems instability and collapse, global supply chain disintegration, resource scarcity, price volatility, rise in migration, geopolitical conflict, tariffs, disruptions to workforce, purchasing power. The more each of them gets aggravated, they interact with each other, and really in a not so distant future, we're really speaking within several years from now, that the scale of disruption will be such that most likely on the current scenario, what we say the most vulnerable industries will begin collapsing. And this is really the beginning of the cascade of events, or like a downward spiral or dominoes of the global economy shrinking by disaster, which also features collapse of the financial system and wiping out of wealth and shareholder portfolio value and the things that you mentioned. A lot of people use this phrase, the economy will shrink by design or by disaster. Right? It's again one of those things that everybody says, and it's generally very vague and abstract. What will that actually look like? Like, how does that come about, that the economy shrinks by disaster? And that's really one of the very defining aspects of the meta disruptions. One of the findings for us was that if we speak about how most of us will be affected, and by most of us, I mainly now am speaking about middle classes around the world, and especially in the global north. So it's not really all of us, most of us, but how most of the listeners probably will be impacted will be by collapse of the economic system, the financial system, collapse of ocean ecosystems, and the global food systems, and so on, which all of that is likely to play out in the 2030s. Whereas the dominant view is that most people's lives will be touched when, the atmosphere warms by 3 degrees, which is actually probably a decade later.
Yes, it's actually social systems that are going to impact us more than the greater long-term threats of, the biosphere degrading.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The collapsing of the human-made systems will precede the full ecological collapse fully playing out, for sure. At the same time, there is a notable exception, I would say, of the ocean ecosystems collapsing, which is happening extremely, extremely fast, and that is likely to happen also very soon, and that will impact also all of us probably very severely because of its interlinking with the global food systems and so on. And now, what does it mean for business and the shrinking of the global economy, right? It means that when the scale of disruption comes to this point, then multiple industries probably at the same time will essentially fail to be able to continue producing profits because the conditions for business will be so hostile. And some industries are already now stretched pretty thin, right? Really on the threshold of profitability. And now let's imagine all of these trends actually getting a lot worse, right? When multiple industries collapse at the same time in multiple parts of the world, we've never seen this before, really. And it definitely goes outside the realm of what governments could possibly bail out, right? So it's not like it's something that will pass or it can be somehow solved. It's just something that unfolds. And the moment it happens, the downward spiral of economic contraction really begins. Because if you imagine multiple industries collapsing, unprecedented scale of mass unemployment, which also means an unprecedented scale in purchasing power, and therefore people buying less and less of what they were buying before, and therefore other industries having difficulty producing profits while also at the same time being exposed to all the other sources of disruption.
Right.
This just creates such a huge shock that it's very unlikely that both the financial and the monetary systems would be able to survive that level of shakeup in the overall system. I would even go as far as to say that the general belief in the concept of money that's not a precious metal in your hand is very likely to
abstract digital number on a screen. Yeah.
Digital number on the screen that you can buy something with, that's very likely to go away. This is really why it has such enormous impacts, because we can speak about what industries are the most likely to be the most vulnerable or so, but it's not like we can have, let's say, 30% of the global economy collapse and the rest of the economy will stand on its own, right?
So no, because again, a lot of what you're talking about is that everything is interrelated. Every business, every industry needs to be taken this seriously because they all rely rely on other partners, other suppliers across the whole man-made systems?
Yeah, so what I'd want to say is, I mean, leaving aside for a moment the question of compatibility with the future, if a significant part of the economy suddenly collapses, then there's no way that the rest of the economy would stay untouched. It's just not how things work. Right. And that means that the differentiation between the industries that might collapse first and the ones that might experience, let's say, decimation of the volume of value being produced and so on, I would say it maybe is like a difference in 1 or 2 years. So it's really like splitting hair. Every single industry will be severely affected. So many players going out of business and so on. And the end of the belief in digital money for some time is also why all shareholder value and all personal wealth for that matter will be affected, because any liquid assets, which means digital money, which means numbers on a screen, will lose value possibly overnight. Right. But because of the amount of chaos and turmoil and lack of social cohesion and political instability, then also any tangible assets, property, gold, whatever, will be very difficult to defend in that circumstances. I mean, first of all, the public goods and the human systems of law and order and police, how long can you maintain that when you cannot pay people for their jobs? And how long can you maintain your private army or anything like this when you cannot pay for their jobs?
Yeah, it definitely forces us to think about what are our true needs for survival and what do we mean by value. What I'm coming back to in my head a lot is we often so much as a company focus on financial value creation, but really to be resilient, to be anti-fragile, you have to think far more holistically beyond that. How do we go from that to your concept in the book as well about companies having an unsustainable core and needing to then change to more regenerative ways of business?
So one thing that we haven't really said to the last part of the scale of disruption, the end of the financial system and so on, is that what it really means is at minimum decimation of shareholder value, meaning shrinking to a tenth of its size and maybe less because of everything we've said. But the bigger issue is also that on the current trajectory, with all of the collapsing processes happening at the same time, then by 2050 plus or minus, the conditions conducive to business such that would allow a future rebooting of anything resembling a global economy will essentially cease to exist, which means it's not just about that, oh yes, in the 20s everything goes out of the window. It also means that later down the line, we are really preempting shareholder value and we're making it impossible to create shareholder value in the future on the current trajectory. It's not just for the financial sector, for anyone that owns anything, this has very significant implications.
And that then connects to the concept in your book about having an unsustainable core. Then what you're doing by definition is unsustainable and needs to change. How does your book then help business leaders think about what that looks like in practice?
Just to come back to the unsustainable core business term, right? At the moment, how we understand and define sustainability is completely off track, right? How we say sustainable means doing less harm, which is actually by definition unsustainable in the current context. And also when it comes to the practices of mainstream corporate sustainability, it has really been pushed into a corner of nudging around the edges of what we call the core business. It means, adding an initiative here and reducing a little bit of waste there without actually being allowed to ask and answer whether the core business is sustainable or not, in the sense of, is it viable, tenable into the future? Is it compatible with livable conditions on the planet, with well-being for all? And it's really interesting that also in public disclosures, whether they are financial or non-financial, we are also not asking and answering this question, even though that's actually the most important question for investors and shareholders, right?
That's exactly it. If we need long-term returns, that's what the question should be.
Yes, exactly. So most businesses around the world at the moment, the core business is unsustainable. And this is because they haven't really been optimized to be compatible with a livable future, well-being for all, and so on and so forth. They've been optimized to maximize profit regardless of the consequences for the amount of harm, environmental or social harm created. And unfortunately, that means that very often, as the room for improvement reduces and optimization reduces, you end up really only being able to maximize profits by maximizing environmental destruction and social exploitation. Like, there's no other way that you can continue growing your margins. And that's why we see so much of what we see with, built-in obsolescence and other things that are actually so annoying even for us as consumers. But again, how will they grow their value otherwise, right? So moving from that to actually being compatible with a livable future on the planet and with well-being for all, right? So what is essential here to realize, and that's what we also realized only through actually doing the work, the systemic projections, really spelling out the range of plausible futures and the implications for business, is that for us to be able to have a global economy in the future, one, there's quite a few things that need to be done, again, within a very short span of time. And these include, of course, removing the systemic causes of planetary overshoot, the current economic system, and remediating the large-scale accumulated damage to the air systems. But also, because of the design constraints of the future, the resource scarcity, energy scarcity, the deteriorating infrastructure, all those things, it's very unlikely that there could be a sizable future economy, anything at all comparable to today's size, without a large humanity. In like one of the sci-fi versions of the future, it would mean that there is a large robotic workforce or something like that, right? But we're unlikely to be able to do that because of the resource energy constraints and all that. The technology advancement, the decoupling from all the issues is not happening fast enough. And so for us to have a big enough economy in the future, we need a big humanity. Having a big humanity amid meta disruption and beyond, when we are unable to grow food, we have an infertility crisis, we have a water crisis, collapse of the ocean ecosystem, and 3 billion people lose their source of protein borderline overnight, and so on and so forth.
What they need for survival.
Yeah, the amount of toxicity in the environment, apart from infertility, also causing a huge rise in prevalence of cancer and other issues, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And of course, apart from that, also, again, all the social instability, all the conflict, all the migration, and so on. Amid all these horrible, horrible features of all plausible futures, how do you have big humanity to power your big economy? Right? The only way you can do it is if you orient the economy working towards well-being for all. It means securing the essential needs for all, the sufficiency-based well-being economy, right? So this was kind of a big discovery for us ourselves. And so what does it mean to be future compatible?
Yes.
Right. So a business that is currently an unsustainable core business can only be compatible with a future economy if it can really be a part and pillar of this well-being economy. And that means that it either focuses on delivering essential needs. That's what they are in the business of. That's the mission. Or solving some of the complex real-world problems, such as the remediation of the large-scale accumulation of damage to our systems, such as, forever chemicals being everywhere. It's not easy to fix. Addressing the different systemic issues, systemic causes. Yeah, that's one of the elements that's definitely necessary for future compatibility. And then when it comes from that to operating models, it's really doing what the world needs in ways that don't cause either environmental or social, societal harm, right? And this may be impossible in absolute terms. We may need to have some budgets for damage that can be regenerated, absorbed, and so on. But it definitely means causing a small fraction of environmental harm on an aggregate level as the whole economy compared to what we're doing now. And those are the most important actually defining features. And one of the very important things that this means on the level of metrics, this is actually something that also has started coming up a lot now that the book is out. So what metrics do you use, or how do you measure this, right?
Is that multi-capital accounting and measuring beyond financial value? Is that one way that you think about it?
Yes and no. What is more important to grasp at the moment, given the severity of the situation, is the difference between fine-tuning and what we call coarse tuning. Coarse tuning really as the opposite of coarse and fine. Coarse tuning really meaning getting the broad stroke right before being obsessed with the detail. We really need to do calibration first. And all of our metrics at the moment have been focused on the fine-tuning part. Even if we switch from monocapitalism to multi-capital accounting and measures, that's something that can help us with the fine-tuning once we are actually at the point of, okay, now we really want to make sure that the companies that remained are sticking to their allocations from the global budgets of how much exposure, how much impacts of the global air systems and so on we can sustain, we can make work. But at the moment, we really need to get the basics right. And that means less preoccupation with percentage change here, percentage change there, and much more preoccupation with metrics that actually are binary. It's a yes or no answer, right? Again, are we in the business of doing what the world needs in ways that don't cause social and environmental harm? That's a yes or no question.
Yes, it's incremental shifts is not enough anymore. And what you were saying about, it's either yes or no are you creating value without causing harm to people or planet? It's a binary in that sense. If you are to be sustainable, you have to meet that criteria. I think John Ehrenfeld calls it reducing unsustainability, and that's not what we need right now. What we need is systemic change.
Yes, there's also a common misconception that we move away from incremental change by every company doing their fair share. And that's an approach that's, again, 20 years too late, because we are so far into Earth overshoot, that a handful of companies staying within their allocations from the global budgets is not going to avert anything, which means that we need the first to go way beyond their fair share. And that's where it also comes to the systemic change part, that, for example, metrics such as, are we addressing the breached planetary boundaries and remediating the accumulating harm and being on track to restoring that where possible by 2030? That's a yes or no question. Right. The same way, are we addressing the systemic causes of human rights violations and the undershoot of the social foundations and being on track to fixing that, again, let's say by 2030, because that's when we need to have a well-being economy in place. And the same goes for, are we on track for bringing forth a well-being economy within the next 3 to 5 years? That's a yes or no question, right? All the future shareholder value, the future viability of the global economy, the future retention of any personal wealth, of the portfolio values, all that stuff depends on the stability and sustainability of the outer context. Spoiler alert, in case somebody didn't notice, nobody is in charge of, let alone on top of, securing that stability and sustainability of the global context. Government's doing it. It's not the intergovernmental supranational organizations doing it. Nobody's in charge. Nobody's doing it. Nobody's really taking care of it happening. What it means for organizations and for shareholder duty, for fiduciary duty, is that big business leaders really need to take this upon themselves. This is the responsibility.
Completely.
This is, if you want to retain shareholder value into the future, you have to ensure stability and sustainability of the outer context, and hence these metrics. We on track with bringing forth a well-being economy in 3 to 5 years, yes or no? And if no, then there's no future shareholder value. And it's, of course, not that one company can do it alone. But then again, the underlying metrics are, have we found and activated the right allies? Are we doing the joint interventions with those allies that can make this happen? Yes or no, right? There's no percentage there.
It creates that clarity. I want to reference a quote from an interview you gave to Regeneration Journal, and you said, you need to match your level of courage to your level of privilege. And I'm sure a lot of people listening, maybe they are in positions of relative privilege. And the question really is then, what can you do to step up? And
so this is one of those questions that a lot of people are not going to like the answer. What that looks like is getting over our intuitive need for safety and comfort and tendency to protect our status and the aversion to being criticized and let alone ridiculed or ostracized and so on. And of course, the challenge is that the prospects of any of these achievements being jeopardized, the possessions, the status, the comfort, the reputation, they are big triggers for shame and grief, right?
Yeah.
They are actually bigger barriers to systemic change than the things that people usually quote. Pressure for short-term shareholder returns and incorporation charters and whatever. These inner barriers are much more a barrier than any of these kind of paper tigers, as I call them. And so we need to get over those, and we need to step into the historic responsibility. And one way I think could work for people to help them get over, again, these barriers, is that we need to realize that and contemplate that sticking one's neck out and being the first mover and risking the reputation and the comfort and the status and so on is actually the best of bad options. If you really play the movie till the end, if you map out how you personally, your loved ones, your inner circle, your wealth, whatever it is that you care about, how is it likely to be affected on the current trajectory in that meta-disruption period a few years down the line, really, you will see that it really means all your privilege being stripped away, all your achievements being stripped away. The more privilege you have, the more traumatized you will be by it being stripped away. And it also really means at that point, no longer having that power and influence to drive any change, any outcome. So I would imagine that if we continue on the current trajectory, then people who had power and influence now and could have acted and don't will be actually pulling their hair out and really cursing themselves and hating themselves in the future.
This also really highlights the importance of timing, that if you're aware of these issues and if you're thinking, how can I even start dipping my toes into whether it's employee activism or trying to be a consultant in driving business change, now's the time to do it. Like, there's not going to be a better time, because every year that passes, you can have more impact. You have the book that people can reach out to you for. So how else can listeners engage with your thought leadership?
Okay, so at the moment, there are a few free resources. There's a video summarizing the key insights for business leaders. There's, of course, the publicly available executive summary to the ebook. And there's going to be more going forward in terms of webinars. There is another public online session about systemic foresight, about our book, about what it means for business, for strategy, and so on, hosted by Business Declares. Also, by the time this is released, it will be available as a recording. We actually have whole set of both the organizational exercises, the organizational toolkit, and also the personal exercises that map out what does this mean for our business, what is the best available strategy, what should we do, what are the systemic interventions we should be driving, and the same analogy of that for my life, my inner circle, and so on, the best available adaptation and mitigation strategy for me, what is mine to do, what are the interventions I should be driving, how can I be contributing to driving change. So we have all of this available. We offer them as gated trainings on our website, and if somebody can't find them, they can reach out and we'll point them to where those things are.
Yeah, and I'll add some of those links to the show notes. Thank you as well, because this conversation for me has really helped to even more clearly see it's not just about business transformation, it's actually about transformation of ourselves and stepping up personally. That's only really how business itself is going to change as well, with those courageous leaders who are ready to willingly risk stripping privileges, risk stripping power. Thank you so much, Alice, for your viewpoints and everything you've shared today.
Thank you for having me. I hope it has been helpful for listeners.